Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, joined by Matt as always. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well, David.
And we're thrilled for this. It's been a long time coming. We have Breht O'Shea. You know him from Rev Left podcast and also from Red Menace. Breht, thank you so much for joining us over here at Left Reckoning.
Absolutely. It's an honor to be here. This is certainly well past due. I've been a fan and followed both of your work for many years now. And I think we've even talked in the past about trying to make something happen. But, you know, things happen in their own time. And I'm glad to finally be here.
Yeah, no time.
We were able to get you on TMBS, weren't we, Breht? If unless we were just thinking about that. Yeah. So Breht is a TMBS alum as well. Yep.
Yeah.
And like,
that's true.
You know, a little plug for Brett's work. Like I've been listening to Breht for a long time, and both Rev Left and Red Menace are really great resources. I know a lot of people over here at Left Reckoning love like the theory readings that we do. I mean, what they do over there is a really, really great resource. So if you're not already listening,
graduate school,
it's graduate
to
school.
Our undergrad,
Well, thank you. Very kind.
But yeah, I mean, we wanted to get you on to talk about a few things. So we're going to talk a little bit about the MAGA communism towards the end. But before we, get to dessert, I wanted to talk to you a bit because, you're from Nebraska, and, a big part of the project here on Left Reckoning was realizing that, at least in media, a lot of like left-wing media is very centered, in like the major metropolitan areas. And there's a kind of writing off of people from states. I don't like the term red state, frankly, but, people use that. It's places like, well, basically, we're just going to build a movement in like New York, LA, and then, maybe it will expand at some point. But I mean, I wanted to have you on to hear your perspective, like being somebody from Nebraska, knowing like the struggles that working people go through. I mean, could you give people an understanding, from like your life, about like the radical potential that is very much in all of these places that we should be unlocking?
Yeah. No, it's a great point. These states are often, sort of dismissed by certainly the liberal elite, but even people on the so-called socialist or revolutionary left, because they see them as either wastelands, as not important, or as just full of an insert stereotype about rednecks here, right? And that is certainly not the case if you've lived here. I've only lived in 3 places in my life: Nebraska, Iowa, and Montana. And, there's a lot of interesting people here, and there's a lot of really good, hardworking people, and a lot of them do not fit the stereotypes that people have about flyover country and about what people, even like quote unquote white working people in these places, think and believe. There's certainly a fair amount of social conservatism, certainly in some areas, a lot of religion. But I also think the upper Midwest is a little different culturally than, let's say, the Southwest or the Deep South on those regards. And in some ways, I think like there's almost a more moderate streak in like even conservatives in the upper Midwest in particular. When I went to Montana, for example, I was kind of taken aback by the center right there also having, at least when I was there, at least in my interactions with some people, like pro-environmental policies, right? Like, because they really did care about the beautiful land around which they lived. Up in Montana as well, I lived on the edge of the Crow Reservation, and the small little town I lived in called Hardin, Montana, like 50% just like white cowboys and 50%, Crow tribe, indigenous people. Mm-hmm. And the way they interacted was very interesting. I mean, it wasn't one of racial tension, at least not in that area. I'm sure there are plenty of areas where that is the case, but it was really deeply integrated. And I learned a lot. I met a lot of indigenous friends, and I learned about the indigenous struggles, and I saw firsthand the poverty on indigenous land. So that's to say that a lot of the stereotypes people have are wrong. And just like anywhere else, working people here suffer. People stand to benefit from any sort of economic and political struggle that advances the ball for the working class as a whole. When you really talk to people, even like my grandparents are farmers from Iowa, like they born and raised on a farm. If you just saw their life story, you would assume, right-wing people. They are incredibly like progressive, and they have very interesting things when you actually talk to them about like what policies do you support, or here's a critique of capitalism or imperialism, maybe in different terms, and they'll respond in ways that really disprove a lot of these stereotypes. So humans everywhere are complicated, are multifaceted. And I would argue that here, as well as anywhere else in the world, working people would bend in class politics. And I think you can really make headway with people if you just are a normal person and talk to them about their actual material needs and material interests, and don't lose them in jargon or try to deceive them, as we might talk about later. Good, solid people in general. And there's no reason why any political movement, specifically internationalist communist one, should have anything but interest and curiosity towards these people and, organizations to help struggle to meet their material needs as well as everybody else's in the country and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important perspective, and I want to bring you on to talk about a lot of different things, but listening to you for a few years, I always had a lot of comfort, hearing a bit of your story and your perspective, because for me, it's tough to be on the left. Like, we're out of power, we're disorganized as a movement, and you get that moment every once in a while. It's like, man, it might be worth just sort of giving up and just trying to have fun with my friends and, climb out. But what always gives me a lot of hope, despite bad political situations, is growing up really poor in the South, when times were hard for my family, it was our neighbors who were always showing up and doing that kind of community support. Without it was ingrained in the culture. You see those kind of glimpses of what a better world could look like, and that's always been a real guiding force in my life, which makes me really frustrated when I hear people denigrate people from certain parts of the country because of where they live.
Right. I would also add, there's the other side of denigration is overly fetishize these people as well, right? You see that in other groups of people are either denigrated or fetishized to cartoonish levels, and there's a little bit of that as well. I think we'll get into a little bit when we talk about MAGA communism and the white working class or whatever. But there's also this way in which you can disrespect fetishizing them by pretending that they are, or acting as if they're pawns in your game and not fully formed human beings that are worthy to be met as an equal.
Yes.
That happens as well. So the other side of denigration is fetishizing.
Yeah. And on that, I mean, it's a similar subject, but, your work has been very much doing this kind of proletarian education, public education work. And, there's these kind of weird online debates that we get from time to time where it's oh, well, you shouldn't ask a working person to read theory, right? And you'll get either one, they won't understand it, or two, you're creating unnecessary barriers and things like that. And I think that that's very wrong-headed for a couple reasons. One, because it's really insulting actually to act like some people can't understand something, especially when it's things that directly affect their life. And two, if you look at socialist organizations throughout history, the first thing they do is political education. Why? It's multifaceted, in my opinion, right? It's one, to arm people with knowledge. And two, it's also very democratizing, because if you create an organization where the only people who know what's going on and know what's up are the people who are sitting there at the top with the knowledge, and they sort of have this barrier, I've read the books, you haven't, so you need to follow me. I think it creates a barrier. But I'd be curious to hear, for somebody who's been spending a few years doing this kind of work, from a very, solid proletarian background with an audience of working class people, could you talk a bit about why theory, and particularly Marxist theory, is such an important weapon for trying to build a strong socialist movement in the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. So, theory is just absolutely essential. And when it comes to politics, it's weirdly controversial, but for almost anything else, it's not. Theory, the best theory that we have from the Marxist tradition, is also formed through actual political struggle. So look at somebody like Lenin, right? He's not only just sitting back in his armchair coming up with ideas about what he thinks a successful communist movement should do or should look like, but he's actually leading one or participating in a communal leadership of an actual world historical revolution, and he's doing theory simultaneous to it. So before, during, and after the successful Bolshevik Revolution, you had, a brilliant leader of that movement actually, getting exiled, coming back in the struggle, also deeply rooted in Marxism, being able to theorize what's happening as it unfolds and hand down that information to us. Now, outside of politics, I use just anything. I'll talk about a car mechanic. Who would you rather trust? A guy who just read a bunch of books on mechanics, or sat back and had a wonderful armchair idea about what, cars really need and the best way to fix an engine, or do you want a guy 30 years in, hands calloused, you can't even, all blackened from oil, telling you what his actual experience are and how to actually fuck with cars? It's a no-brainer.
No, I mean, yeah. No, I mean, like, on that, it's like, who would you rather have working on your car? A mechanic down the road or Elon Musk, right? I'll
exactly.
Who I'd rather be helping me out with that.
Exactly. Now on top of that, though, some people are just more predisposed to wrestling with abstract ideas. Some people certainly are like more disposed to be a nerd and read the books and learn about all the funny jargon, right? And that's certainly, I'm a kind of a nerd in that way. But the moment you start taking that and really understanding it, you can then turn it just into everyday language, because the ideas behind the jargon are things that are meant to connect with the international working class and the material needs of regular working people. So I don't need to go in and talk to my grandparents or the friend down the street or my high school buddies about dialectical materialism or whatever. But I can put into basic words and communication the stuff that I learned through theory and literally could not have learned anywhere else. And then, that's what the teacher's role is. The teacher's role is maybe to digest, complex information and able to communicate it much more effectively. And of course, the benefit of a party, a communist party, any sort of high organized political formation, is that organization itself begins to be a pedagogical, educational formation, bringing up the analysis and the understanding of the people in that organization. And that's always been the case with socialist revolutions. It's always been the case with vanguard parties, the ones that are successful. Is that they turn the entire party into something that brings people in and lifts them up intellectually and practically through actual political and economic struggle.
Yeah, I mean, like, just listening to, a lot of the stuff on Rev Left, like, you make this point a lot that I think, you're just touching on it, but I think it's really important too when it comes to theory, like it really being beneficial to do that collectively instead of individually. And sometimes people denigrate like reading groups as, just like a BS activity, but like a lot of really important socialist movements actually came out of reading groups. I think a lot more than people think. And like, like obviously like there's I'm going to mess that word up. I won't say the teaching theory of of doing reading theory, reading like in a group, but like on the political level, I mean, I'd be really happy if you could describe how important that is to like building a strong movement and also building your own understanding of these kind of things.
How important theory is for all of that?
No, sorry, reading, like doing these things collectively instead of individually.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It's actually a hallmark, I would say, of like Marxist knowledge formation, is this idea that it is going to inherently involve collective struggle and collective minds working on a problem. And the most successful socialist communist movements are ones that take that very seriously. And you can see what happens when you don't take that seriously. When, especially in the modern age with the internet, individuals with just ideas that they come up with or put together can convince enough people that they have the right idea, that they are the true socialists, they have the true understanding. Everybody else is a fake or a fraud. The first thing I tell young lefties is always turn away and walk the hell away from anybody who says that they individually in their little cranium have the solutions and the real answers, and everybody else, especially those that criticize them, are frauds and fakes and not real. They don't really understand. No, it's utterly important to work together on problems, because understanding the complexities of political economy and social ebbs and flows and the cultural and historical moment is always going to be too big for one mind to grasp. And even if you're a very brilliant person that can hold a lot of amazing thoughts in your head at one time, if you're not infused into a group of other people that you're struggling next to over your shared interest, then you're just floating off in the clouds. Maybe you can offer some interesting insights, but that's about all. And so it's not just the collective formation of knowledge, but how knowledge gets formed through collective struggle itself. So you can never separate theory and praxis. And you can never separate the individual from the community. I also believe that. And something I always talk about on that front is we always hear about individualism and how essential individualism is. but healthy individuals only grow from healthy communities. And so if you really care about individuals and lifting individuals up and letting people, pursue their own goals in life as individuals, it should be a bedrock priority of yours to foster healthy communities out of which individuals emerge. And I think that's one of the things about dialectics, whether we're talking about community versus individuals or practice and theory, we understand the deep unification of these things, that they're not separate static categories, but they're deeply and utterly entwined. And if you get a grasp of one, you have to get the grasp of the other. And there's also the level of accountability, right? So when you are organizing in your community, you are accountable to the people that you're dealing with, your fellow organizers, as well as the people you're helping. If you're in a union drive, you are accountable to the other people in that union struggle, and you are all fighting for the similar end. And that really humbles individuals, and that puts whatever talents and insights you might have as an individual to real service for the collective. But when you're isolated from that, when you're actually like in this new MAGA communism shit, actively hostile to organizing and organizers, well, you see how these errors and deviations and egomaniacs can just rise because there is no accountability. You're not engaged in any struggle. You have no the day. And, you can just sit back in your armchair and talk shit into a camera forever and get a following and make money off of it, but you're not going to do anything for anybody else. And so I truly believe that knowledge formation and struggle must be collective, must be communal, and individuals actually benefit from being embedded within communities.
So reading between the lines, you don't mean we can trick people in the marketplace of ideas using the correct buzzwords. There's no room for that. Okay.
Exactly. Or even that your priority should be to try to operate in the realm of ideas and convince people, right? Like I just got to go onto the forum. If enough of us get onto this MAGA forum, we can convince some of these Trumpers. No, you build it by struggling alongside people for material gains. That's how you actually convince people of your politics.
Right. Well, but I think we're dancing around it, so we might need to dive in 1 second. But just one last thing before we get to the MAGA communism thing. Are you familiar with? Have you ever heard of the iron law of oligarchy before, Breht? It's for people who aren't familiar. It's a really interesting and damning theory about what happened with a lot of the union and social democratic movements throughout the 20th century, where like the quick and easy version of it is that you have somebody who's like genuinely a part of like the labor movement, part of like the working class struggle, and then through like the power of that movement, they get propelled into maybe political office or leadership of a union, and then they start to realize when they're spending time with people in power that like I'm parroting Leo Panich here, y'all. Those people don't have horns on their heads, and maybe a couple of them are really nice. And you realize that, like, for your own individual needs, it's actually important to sort of, placate your base, but but you keep the knowledge that you're getting from how the state functions, from how these, negotiations are working. If you're a union representative or something like that, from the base, for a couple of reasons. One, because you want to make it seem like you are operating at such a high intellectual level that no one else could understand the decisions that you're making. And two, the most important one is that you realize that if you start telling everybody how you're operating, then it'd be very easy for somebody else to sort of maybe come up and take your nice position. And it's a real problem on particularly in like the democratic socialist left of trying to avoid this crisis. We're certainly seeing it in real time with figures like AOC, somebody who has a lot of knowledge about the state, is sort of tenuously, I would argue at this point, related to the movement at large. And it's not an easy thing to actually find a way to avoid without having a lot more what's the word, without having discipline's one way to put it, but I think even avoiding like the negative, like actually having a lot more of communication between maybe representatives and like the membership, and also really trying to foster an environment like you're talking about here of like knowledge sharing, recognizing that if you have information, if you have knowledge, if you have perspective, then it's actually to your own benefit and to the movement's benefit to be actively educating people and sharing that information with folks.
Yeah, definitely. And that's where structure and organization really come into play. The Democratic Party is not accountable to communities, it's not accountable to the working class. And even if you get right into the Democratic Party on the backs of a movement, you're very quickly isolated from them. You're in the Capitol building, you're talking to Nancy Pelosi, and you're starting to play the game. So you're completely now divorced from whatever community might have given you in the first place. And there's just like a default momentum there that, unless you're completely, truly principled, you will be swept up by. And then we live in a hyper individualist, careerist culture where once you, especially if you come from nothing, I'm not saying AOC in this, I'm just talking more generally. If you come from nothing and then you start to make a little way and people start praising you, and maybe your bank account looks a little nicer than usual, and it's very easy in our culture, especially without those organizational structures, to keep you immediately accountable, to kind of float off into your own individualist, careerist ambitions. And you'll have every reason to. You can convince yourself that what you're doing is actually good. Like, okay, yeah, I fell back on some of the principles that I said I believed in, but you know what? If it wasn't me, somebody worse would be in this position, and they would have power. So, I'm doing what I have to do to keep this position, because God, what can we imagine what would happen if I wasn't in this position and somebody worse was, right? And you can just see how that logic is not even an evil person or even somebody that's like, oh, it's all about me, but you can just see how you just start convincing yourself. And that's why you can't leave it up to individuals and their supposed ostensible integrity, but there has to be mechanisms of accountability. And there has to be, especially in this context, if we're going to play the electoral route, an ability for the community that launched you in that position to recall. And that would necessitate, among many other things, a complete break from the Democratic Party. And it would have to be a party of our own, with our own structures and our own, ability to hey, we're going to put this person up for candidate. We're going to fund them. We're going to promote them and everything, but they are immediately recallable and accountable to this broader organization. And so those are the things that would be absolutely necessary to prevent what we see over and over and over again. Also, I just want, as a last point, if you are going to get into this messy world politics and you say, like, there's no third party, I have to go in as a Democrat or whatever, then you just, I kind of think, like, put myself in that position or anything, like, to stay super principled, you might have to fucking lose that next election. But you might be able to advance the ball for the actual, for your class or for your constituency, if nothing else, maybe rhetorically, or, push something, but be ready to take the bullet, be ready to be like, oh, you're too radical, the Democrats and Republicans have turned on you now. I'll leave electoral politics because I'm going right back to the people. I'm going right back to where I came from, and I'm going to keep doing work wherever I can. And those sorts of people would be nice, but they're very rare.
Yeah, I just bring this up because we've been trying to revisit some of the history of socialist movements on Left Reckoning, to try to learn some of the lessons, because like we see like the problems in the general sense, but then like the practical strategy things, it's really difficult. Like we can see with the traps, but then trying to find ways to build movements that are successful makes it tough. I bring all this up so that we can get to the dessert here, because there's this new kind of grand idea, right? And like we're talking about structure and how important building structures are, but you see this kind of like fantasy politics on the left, and we're talking about MAGA communism, and we're going to debunk it a bit. But if people want like the line by line thing, Breht did an excellent episode on Rev Left, or was it on Red Menace?
Both. It was
okay,
on both.
Okay. That y'all can listen to. We've done long videos on it. This is like, if you're watching this and you want like the line by line debunking, there's other stuff out there. I wanted to talk a little bit about where you think this sort of comes from, because it is this kind of like weird fantasy politics where it's like, the problem with the left is the branding's wrong. And if we just had like a cool branding that was attractive to some folks, then we would be able to avoid all these kind of pitfalls. Honestly, like, I think these problems are actually much more fundamental than even that, but trying to give them their best, understanding is like, if we just fix like the aesthetics of our movement, we're going to be able to win the game. And like, just like you were saying, it's like, we're not gonna be able to go on forums and change a bunch of people's minds. It doesn't matter how cool your website is or your logo is or something like that. Like real socialist work comes from organizing and mobilizing the people, because that is fundamentally what our power is. Anyways, I've gone on a little too long on this, but like, this kind of like Hail Mary, like we're going to skip the game of organizing politics that is like very much fundamental to MAGA communism. But I see it all the time with things like People's Party or things like that, that we're going to not have the, you can't have the People's Party until you have the people, right?
Exactly. Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I think in that episode, my co-host Allison made a good point. We're just talking about where these deviations and these errors come from, because it's not new. And we released an episode right on the heels of that episode of MAGA Communism on Lyndon LaRouche and his movement. And it's point for point. I mean, they embraced American patriotism first, then they replaced comrade with patriot, and then they're like the new left and their identity politics are bad, and the black radical movement is bad. And, before you know it, they're taking lead pipes to leftist rallies and physically assaulting, communists and socialists while still claiming to be ones themselves. And so that's not saying that that's what MAGA communism is or going to be, but just that this is not new. And if you're a young, disaffected person who's only really been into politics, mostly online for the last couple of years, and you don't know much about history, I mean, this is a chapter in history that you have to really go search and find. You could easily be like, oh, this is new and exciting. And then there's another layer of despair, which I think we've gotten at it a few different angles here, but Allison talks about on that show, where it's hard being on the fucking left. And it's hard being on the left in the United States, the belly of the capitalist imperialist beast, and the locust from which all anti-communism of the last century has more or less emanated out of. And it's dispiriting. And there is a sort of despair that people just kind of give up in their own way, but they'll convince themselves that, well, this is not giving up. This is not even a basicism. This is actually an innovation on it, or this is actually something new and exciting, whereas the old boring guys and fight for unions, it's just too much work, and I'm online most of the time anyway, and this is cooler, especially if you're a white guy. If you're a white guy who like was pissed off that Bernie lost, oh, you're very susceptible. I can still be a patriot, I can still be a chauvinist, I can still elevate machismo and patriarchy. I don't have to take any lessons from feminists or radicals whatsoever. Hell yeah, sign me up. I'm a MAGA comm, So there's a lot of reasons: despair, not wanting to do the actual work, being way too online, and just having this not being challenged, right? Because to be a really principled Marxist, to be a principled revolutionary, you got to unlearn a lot of shit. It's like a long process of like wrestling with your own values and seeing the ways in which you don't quite understand things and trying to connect those dots. And getting out and organizing is so difficult at times and can be so dispiriting. Yeah, I just want to throw my hands up and say, let's jump on some forums and convince some Trump folks that we're on their side. Now, there's so many things to say about this, but at the January 6th, we called a fascist riot on our show. The January 6th, they were holding signs like communism is the real cancer. And, these are people that have fully internalized anti-communism. And if you understand how anti-communism has actually been sort of pervade in this country, it's always hand in hand with like anti-feminism, anti-black liberation. What did they say about MLK? He's a secret communist, right? So these things are always have been in American history deeply, deeply tied. So I don't know. There's all those reasons and more, but I can see why these sorts of deviations happen, and I just feel like it's the role of principled socialists of any stripe to hold the line in good times and in bad. And there's more bad in America than good, but we have to stay principled. We have to combat these things. We have to show this is nothing new. This actually has been done before many times, and it's always failed. There is no replacement for the hard work of organizing and trudging through political education and trying to reach people and building up your own organizations. There is just no shortcut there. And it's a long generational process, and people can get very impatient, to say the least. So that's part of it.
Yeah, I thought your Nelson discussion on that was very strong. I like the point, because initially, we kind of greeted this more as something to laugh about, and I even said like, Godspeed, converting these folks to communists. Like with the trucker protests in Canada, it was the same thing. They were calling Trudeau a communist. And it's like, if you can organize those people for communism, be my guest. Like I'll be here waiting for that. But I also think what you said is like, if there was some sort of like outgrowth purporting to be anarchism, people who anarchism speaks to would feel compelled to speak about it. And we have a concept here on Left Reckoning called the bum steer, which is like, people shouldn't get a push in the wrong direction, especially when they're searching for ways to interpret the world. And that's what's going on here, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's funny because, this comes out of Marxism, Leninism. This is not Marxism, Leninism. This is a specific deviation of a fringe element within it.
Mm-hmm.
But they're actually kind of doing what they accuse the rad libs of, which, you're just tailing the Democrats. You're just trying to use the Democratic Party to get this. It'll never work, right? If you just replace Republican and MAGA with Democratic Party and liberals, they'll give the arguments themselves about why it won't work. But then they want to do the exact same thing to the Republican Party, which is even more anti-communist. And both of those parties, if you know anything at all, are completely captured by capital. You're not going to turn either of those parties. You're not turning either of those parties or the movements at their center into anything resembling socialism. You will just get down the road of reaction. And we actually saw that when they went in there. They went into those forums trying to convince Trump folks, right? And they just they're probably already reaction assholes, these MAGA people. They had to debase themselves, like just trying to talk to a Trump supporter, BLM and Antifa, they're the real fascists. And the guy still wasn't, so he has to elevate it a little more. Women should stay. I'm just making shit up now, but women should stay in the home. Do you like me yet? No, not yet. Yeah. Okay, I'll say a racial slur if you want me to. It's just so debasing, and they don't give a fuck about you. They don't even really know what communism is. They think Nancy Pelosi's a communist, and you're in their forum saying they should transition to communism. They'll put a bullet in your head before they do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sad to see, and it's really pathetic to see people that ostensibly are Marxists have to debase themselves to such an extent, and still in their head solve the cognitive dissonance of I'm actually still a revolutionary that's dedicated to the real abolition of the present state of things, but let me tail the most reactionary backwards elements of the Republican Party. It's just wild. And it's also it's also the aesthetics. We see with sometimes anarchists or rad libs that a protest anywhere is then deemed as good. Oh, it's a protest. They're rising up against their government. It must be good. There's no analysis of class, and we talk about that. But what these MAGA comms people are doing the same thing with January 6th and the movement. Well, the real revolutionary energy is here. Look they stormed the Capitol. The left couldn't do that. And so this politics of aesthetics, and then you have a few egomaniacs as the talking heads, and they're obviously interested in their own advancement, their own careerism, but they're convincing to enough people, especially new people. You can see how this stuff develops, but it will quickly, and I probably think it already is dead. There's not going to be we're in 3 months, we're going to hear actually a new political party has emerged and they're fighting for the unionization of all workers.
Yeah.
And I said at the end of our MAGA Com episode.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I said at the end of our MAGA Com, if you think we're wrong about this, if you think we are just completely stupid idiots who are worth nothing and we're wrong about everything, you can prove us wrong. You can just advance the ball for our class by following your and showing us it's superior to ours, and then we will shut up.
Yep. Put numbers on the board.
It is all aesthetics. It's so funny that they came, the same fellows, right? Different name, but they came here to Austin, and they held a event in a hotel lobby, where they had the Soviet flag and they were singing songs. I will say not in the most orderly fashion as you would hope, but anyways, that was effectively it, right? They got 15 people in a room, and they waved a couple flags together, and I was watching them reporting on themselves, which is always funny. And it was literally that. There's literally the aesthetics at the event were so good, and it's yeah, I mean, it really does seem like this is it, right? But the aesthetics things is there's, I shouldn't be an armchair psychoanalyst or anything like that, but I think it says a little bit about where people's heads are at. But on a more general point, what's so frustrating to me of not just this movement, but we see it a lot. What we should do on the left is we should drop social liberation policies for people. We should become a little bit more hostile to trans people. We should be more hostile to racial liberation, because in their minds, the working class is fundamentally reality, which I think is, one, wrong, and two, extremely insulting. You're seeing in this country right now, as the right wing, I live in Texas, right? It's a state that everyone uses as like like the perfect example of like a right wing state. The abortion law is wildly unpopular. The people who want that are like under like 25% of the population. It is a very small group of the American population who are getting who are getting like their desires met by the state. And there's reasons why the Republican Party does what they want and not others, but the point is like I would be against like throwing our trans brothers and sisters under the bus. I would be against throwing women under the bus. I would be against ending the fight for racial justice in this country just on a personal, like on a moral level, if that was like the argument. Like if maybe that could help us win, I'd be against it. But the fact is that like it doesn't even line up with victory. You know what I mean? Like you guys are making this trade for no benefit to yourself, and all you're doing is attacking and undermining people. And you're not only harming the movement, you're actively participating in propping up movements that are really doing a lot of harm to folks.
Exactly. And it's also the case like with the embrace of it all started with patriotic socialism, the embrace of American patriotism, and they had all these arguments about why it's actually really important to do, but there's never a thought, or if there is a thought, it's just dismissed, of what does waving the stars and stripes represent to the international community, our comrades across the world who have been devastated by the American empire and its political project, which has always been, started off as an aristocratic slave owning, hierarchy. And now it's just a capitalist, brutal hierarchy of like the most undeserving people on the planet having the most money and power in our political system. It has never been anything worth celebrating. And then you push them a little bit and they're like, well, we appreciate the musicians and the people are good and the land is fine. I'm like, okay, that has nothing to do with celebrating the American political state. And it also doesn't translate into getting a mass movement on your side whatsoever. The people are really dedicated to American nationalism already hate you. And then a bunch of people who are apolitical or disenfranchised, Black and Indigenous people, or the international working class, especially in the global South, is outright hostile to the American state. And the American state is synonymous with their oppression. And so it's alienating on every level. And it comes from this idea, often in the heads of like white guys, that the working class is like a white guy in a hard hat. And it's just not the case. The working class is international, multiracial, of every gender identity that you can imagine, and everything else. And so if you're going to have a real revolutionary politic that aims at uniting people across identity in our shared material interest, you cannot throw every single minority in the backseat to appeal to like 5% of a 25% of this country who's dedicated to MAGA. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. And then also like, they look at January 6th and they're like, ooh, that's where the revolutionary momentum is. What about 2020 when Black Lives Matter was burning down police headquarters and chasing the pigs out, or, we're fighting fascists and the literal fascists with Nazi fucking flags in the street. Oh, no, that's leftoid, whatever they say, declass, weird shit, like, whatever his Heideggerian and Carl Schmitt vomit spews out. But yeah, it's silly.
Yeah, I mean, that's like the same sort of brainwave where they decide that teachers and baristas are like part of the aristocracy.
God, exactly.
You know what's amazing about that Brett? I dug up an old Eugene Debs essay, and I can't remember what publication he had. Whatever the newspaper for like the Socialist Party USA was back then. And it was like the exact same. It was responding to that exact same kind of argument, where it's like there are people in our movement who are saying the only workers are a very particular kind of skilled tradesman worker, and they're throwing down what he called the common laborer, the common worker, the unskilled workers. I think in today's parlance for people, and it was just like it was. I was happy to find it because it was a nice educational tool. It was also really depressing to realize, though, that like I think that the MAGA communism thing in particular, like, does come from like a very online brain poison, part of our society. But there's
100%.
always been this tendency in the U.S. and in other countries too, to sort of pick up like the good, real working class and then separate it from the rest of the class, which is like, y'all are just doing like the work of, the early American trade movement, for example, and doing that, saying like there's good workers and there's bad workers. And it's been really depressing, I think, to see it pop its head up over the past couple months, but it's here. And like, I mean, You can take that if you want, but I also wanted to say that, like, I think that this really does come out of like a general, like, I've called it before, like a left pessimism, right?
Yeah.
Where it's just like, a lot of people, they got excited by Bernie, then that movement's not successful, and all the hopes that people had, and they're sort of looking for a quick fix, and either like you get into pure like cynicism, or these kind of weird fantasy, like if I can just put the right inputs, we're ready for revolutionary politics in this country, which I don't think is particularly helpful for actually building a movement to be successful. Because, like, I'm not like a lot of these other folks who are in the left world. Like, I come from the working class, my family's working class. We're not in a position, if any of us get sick, we would have to rely on charity and aid from folks. Like, there is no like escape hatch. Just like, I'm in this shit, you know what I mean? Like, I'm in it forever because of where I come from, and who I am. And I get really frustrated, I think, with these folks who it does seem to be a little bit of a hobby. I'm happy to have a broad movement of a bunch of different folks, but when you have like fancy boys from comfortable backgrounds playing games with this shit, it does get me really mad.
Exactly. And like that's the thing is like two of the guys, I forget, Haas and Hinkle or whatever, talked about like meeting up in LA, and Hinkle comes from a like Orange County conservative wealthy family. These are not people interested in revolution, but they're also not people that have their finger on the pulse of the red state working class, or white working class people. Those are people that are just my family. They're not some abstract fetishized object in their head, and they're imperfect. I mean, there are elements of my family who are just too far dedicated to reaction, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the people are wide open. They're just not what these people think they are. And the idea that like two Twitch streamers from LA are going to come in to Nebraska or Montana or Texas and tell the white working class that they need to combine their love of Donald Trump with communism, completely detached from reality, and that you actually don't have a relationship in any real way with the people who you're claiming want to reach out to, that you're claiming that you could actually, that you're claiming that you want to build a movement with. And that should always be on Bell,
And also, Trump's a loser. Like, he lost. Like, that movement is like losing. So it's like, why tie the success of the global revolution to it in the first place?
Yeah, like to look at Trump and see like people. Wait, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Matt.
I was just gonna say, like, to look at Trump and see like, oh, there's so much popular, energy behind this guy. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of popular energy against him too, like actual record levels, to the point Joe fucking Biden is setting turnout records.
Sleepy Joe, yeah.
Exactly. That should be the humiliating thing, right? Like, you lost to Joe Biden and you're still trying to ride this train out. Like, it's hilarious. Like, it's embarrassing for Hillary to lose to Trump, and then it's humiliating for Trump to lose to Biden. This is just a dying system. And this is what the end of neoliberalism is vomiting up like a hairball, in a cat's throat. It's absurd. And also, like, when he invited, or Hinkle, I think is his name, got invited on Tucker Carlson, he's not, and Jimmy Dore does this as well, he's not inviting you on so that you can make a really good pitch about why we should end capitalism, imperialism. He's inviting you on because, just like why he invites Kanye on and shit, you are going to serve his interests. He is not interested in serving yours. I'm not against talking to reactionaries. I'm not even against going on Carlson, but be principled about it. I mean, what you're doing is, then he starts, like, Hinkle starts talking about globalists and George Soros, and you don't hear capitalism. You never hear the word imperialism. Okay, you are not using that platform to get your message out. You are being used like a pawn by the reactionary right, and you played your role perfectly. It's hilarious if it wasn't so sad.
And one thing to note about Tucker, I have this on good authority, is from somebody who actually had like sort of a communist critique of the Democratic Party, got a call from a Tucker producer, and had their brain picked about those critiques. And at the end of it, they're like, "Hey, I'll just come on and make these critiques," and they never heard back. So if you actually if you actually do get invited on, you have to wonder why your person is more welcome than that person's was.
Absolutely.
And I think the globalist substitution is a really highlighting one, because, like, there's problems with things like global capitalism. There's no doubt about it. But globalism, it implies that there are good and bad capitalists, right? Like, there's patriotic capitalists and there are nationalists. Like, I mean, really, if I were to try to label what the again, I don't think it's a real enough movement. I'm happy to do this because it's funny, and I think we actually are able to talk about some like symptoms of the problem of the left, or at least people who want to be politically engaged now. Um, but it's not a movement. But at the end of the day, like really, what this is like, these guys would be like really into Erdogan if they were in Turkey, and just sort of actually like being sad that like we don't have that same kind of like, a little bit of like national investment politics mixed with like, patriotism and chauvinism.
Yes, yeah, exactly. No, I totally agree. And to touch on your point as well about why we're talking about it, because we even said this in our episode, me and Allison really debated, is this even worth it? Because it's not a real movement. It is an online phenomenon. But we figured it was the reason that we said earlier, Marxists have a responsibility to defend actual Marxism. But also, we used it as a chance to clarify core concepts within Marxism for those newer people who are trying to learn and get into this. I even had somebody reach out. I was a little tempted by these folks. To be honest, they were kind of getting me. But now that you out like this, it was very helpful. And now I understand why this is an error and why this is not worth me putting my time and energy in. That was the real point. It's not necessarily to highlight these people in particular. It's not even really personal. People are allowed to have wrong and bad and different opinions. People are allowed to evolve in a way that I don't approve of. It's not personal. But it's a great opportunity to combat a certain strain of chauvinism and reaction masquerading as Marxism, help clarify core concepts, and let new people know that this stuff is being combated. This is not what our tradition is about. And you can listen to both sides of that argument and come out on whatever side you feel is best, but at least you heard both sides of that argument. And that's why Allison and I finally decided, you know what, it is worth talking about it. We're going to do this with that in mind. It does not personal. It's about clarifying concepts, helping people make sense of this nonsense, and showing that it's nothing new. It's just another reiteration of failed, historical projects. And it's going to do the exact same thing. And just watch. If we are wrong, we will be proven wrong. And I've put out I've staked my claim very strongly. And that is always vulnerable to being proven wrong. And yeah, it's out there. So let's see if they can do it. That's what it is. And that's what I always end any differences on the left with disagreements. I don't even consider these folks on the left really, but even amongst leftist tendencies, it's always like, I have my opinion, you have yours. I don't hate you for that. Ultimately, we'll just see who can advance the ball for our class, who can advance the ball for the fight against brutality and exploitation and domination and unjust hierarchies of wealth and power. And if you do that better than me, you'll win me over by showing that, and we're going to try to do it on our end because we believe what we're saying is true too. And let the dice fall where they may.
And like on that, like, I think that this also shows, as much of a valiant effort as you're making, I think we're trying to make, of doing like, popular left education. Like there is a lot of interest, I think, nationally to understand what Marxism and communism are. I mean, like that's why James Lindsay got so popular, I think. Because people are like, it's a big word, it's scary. A lot of people are confused about it. Then James Lindsay gets to basically come on and say that the Frankfurt School, this is the best interpretation of Lindsay, by the way, because it's mostly a crock of shit. The Frankfurt School basically, is this secret cabal to try to undermine Western society, instead of which most Marxists would argue is that, like, the switch to culture politics that we did in the 60s and 70s was really bad for our movement. But, it shows that there's an appetite out there. And as discouraging as these figures are, I think we should take some encouragement that, like, people want to understand these things a bit better because they don't get that in school. We don't have like a strong organized party or anything like that in this country. So there's a lot of different places that people can go. And I think it's really important for us, even though these things can seem, a little funny or goofy, like there's somebody who's typing in YouTube right now this concept, and they might come to this versus, getting a bunch of BS from someone else.
Exactly right. I agree 100%. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask you, just sort of in closing, because like, the MAGA communism thing is BS. Their willingness to throw people under the bus, I think, is not just like wrong. I think it's very odious to me. But like, you mentioned this a second ago, but like doing left criticism and like how to engage with that project. Because like, look, I'll just say this, like there's a lot of things on the left that I don't think we do very well. There's a lot of things that alienate me. I lived in New York for a little while, and I never felt further away from like where I came from, where I grew up, not just like geographically, but like culturally, socially. And I grew up, again, in the South, but I grew up in like queer community, which I think, again, people should know that that's very, very common, like it is anywhere else. I mean, I always say that, like, well, I shouldn't tell you what I think before I ask you. Like, how can we like responsibly like engage with criticism of like tactics, strategy, maybe pushing it back against like the left becoming like a cultural movement instead of a political movement, responsibly, like with the aim of like having these things win, versus sort of being, because there's a lot of especially since we do podcasts or things like this, there's a lot of games that you can play where it's just like, oh, well, these guys are the fake leftists and they suck and they're selling you out, and you can just do that, and you can either be cynical and say that they're doing it because it makes them money, or that it just like slowly just starts to poison your brain, that you're not even thinking strategically anymore, just trying to find ways to poke at your enemies. But I mean, like, I find that y'all engage with a lot of different conversations, and I'd just be curious, your thoughts on having responsible left criticism, comradely like criticism of each other.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, and I harp on this a lot and always have in my projects, we have to get a hold of our egos individually, because so much of the intensity is certainly happening online, but even politically, when you hear a core political belief of yours challenged, maybe even articulately, it feels as if you are being called out. And once you realize that, you realize, oh, people's sense of self is inexorably tied up with these ideas they might hold now, and it might change, but the feelings of them being under attack if you go after their ideas in a certain way is an attack on the self. And what that does is it shuts down any attempt to want to talk and puts you in defensive posture. So what I always say is we need to de-emphasize individual egos, but egos in general. We need to have not debates, because I think that is a spectacle of ego and narcissism, and it doesn't say anything about who's actually right. It's just who can argue better, or who can be louder, or whatever the case. But reasonable conversations across differences that clarify differences, show where we are on the same page, and sort of flesh out where we can work together on. And that's like kind of a first step, because it's kind of like you almost need to sew up some unity on the actual principle evolutionary left if you want to make a real movement in society broadly. And then you can take those lessons you used forging alliances intra-left to forging alliances more broadly. But I think de-emphasizing egos, emphasizing collective conversation, not debate, goes a long way. And then being a regular person, I said this kind of tongue in cheek, and it can be taken too far, of course, but if you're online all day long, it does something to your brain. And these are platforms that are run by billion-dollar corporations that engineer algorithms to piss you off, make you feel shitty, make you get angry. And so if you are consciously or unconsciously, in most cases, handing your mind over to those algorithms, you're going to the momentum is going to be leading you astray. So you want to de-emphasize being on there. Go on there, talk your shit, form connections, but make it a small part of your life, not where you spend all of your time. And that goes a long way into being what I say normal, which is just being a regular human being that's able to talk to people's differences. Now, Twitter all day, and some liberal comes across or some conservative comes across, what is your muscle memory? Screw you, you're an idiot. I want to dunk on this dude, so funny and so good that I get a bunch of likes and retweets. Try that in real life. You're going to get punched in the face, right? Like, there's real consequence in the real world. And you're not going to convince anybody. So you have to sort of you're training your mind and your muscle memory online to be a sort of an asshole and to be in echo chambers and to get out in the real world, particularly in struggling for, it could be something as simple as like getting a referendum passed in your neighborhood, or, struggling for the unionization of a single Starbucks location. But that gets you in the real world. It gets your hands and your feet and your head in the material world and not floating off into algorithmically structured space. And that goes a long way with just all those things, goes a long way with being able to talk to regular people. And insofar as you can one-on-one conversations, it really gives you a chance. One thing I do when I'm talking to somebody who is not open to my politics initially, or maybe is outright hostile, the first thing I do is not bludgeon them with my viewpoint, but the first thing I do is strategically find some common ground, any common ground, from which I can say, good point, I agree with you. The moment you do that, we're talking about ego and people getting defensive, you've now validated them and their core idea, find something you can agree on. You can agree with a human being on something in most cases. And then once they feel like they've been heard and they've been respected, they're way more willing to hear you out. And if you're in my case, it's like talking to another working class person, you have some advantages. Yeah, it sucks we can't afford healthcare. It sucks how we're getting nickel and dimed. Inflation is going up. The rich and the powerful, they're so clearly undeserving in almost every single case, while regular working people get shit on and have really no say at the table of power and money. It's just corporations talking to governments, talking to militaries, and people are very open to those basic ideas. And then you can get into a disagreement from there. Well, I believe the solution is socialism. Oh, hold on now, bud. I don't know about that. But then at least you're having a conversation where hearts and minds are open and you can make some ground. And then you can walk away with a little fist bump or finishing your beer at the bar and walk out and say, I had a great time talking to you, man. Now that person will go down the road. And at the very least, and I say this often, the next time he hears the word communist, he might not think, oh, mass murder, Stalin, gulag.
Yeah.
He might think, oh, that dude at the bar, had some kind of out there ideas, but was a good guy. And he bought me a beer. Right. And so then you've now humanized our movement. And that's at least a little victory. But that all comes at the expense of ego, at the expense of spending way too much online, and at the expense of being in any sort of hyper confined echo chamber.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it reminds me of something Michael used to say that I think we borrowed from Adam Proctor, but socialism for regular ass people.
Hell yeah.
is a good mantra.
Hell yeah.
But Breht, I really appreciate having you on. We'd love to do it again. Maybe we get you on and talk a little bit about Lenin next time. People should definitely check out Rev Left at Red Menace. Breht, it's truly an honor, and appreciate you so much. And take care, friend.
It's an honor and a pleasure. I'd love to have both of you on Rev Left sometime soon as well. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.